So,
and you were a social psychologist?
No, I'm not. I'm a clinical personality psychologist.
And what is the difference?
Well, one of the differences is that personality and clinical psychology isn't a corrupt enterprise, whereas social psychology fundamentally is. It's been going through an absolute internal revolution over the last 2 years because of its own discovery that many of its fundamental studies and propositions are flawed. I would say social psychology is the most social justice / left-leaning part of psychology, and its methods are generally appalling. They're not well documented, and they produce all sorts of categories that don't exist. Whereas personality, I know it might seem like trivial distinction to people outside of the field, but these disciplines are quite separate from a historical perspective. They develop quite separately. Personality psychologists are very, very careful about defining what they measure. And so, for example, I study the big 5 personality traits. That's extroversion, neuroticism, agreeableness, conscientiousness, openness, and under openness falls intelligence. These are very well documented. We can really measure them. We can't measure them as well as we would like to. We've identified the biological basis for most of the traits, and we understand a fair bit about how they make people different. And personality psychologists have been very, very careful about measurement, whereas social psychologists are, as a general rule, very, very cavalier about their concepts, and that's led to a tremendous pollution, I would say, of the psychological literature. The implicit association test is a good example of that. That's the test that's being used to assess people's unconscious biases, unconscious racial biases. And so, for example, if I showed you a bunch of pictures of black people and a bunch of photographs of white people, and then I asked you to associate a good or a bad word with the black people or the white people to respond after you've seen the picture. If you are white and you saw white photos, you'd be faster at responding to the positive words. And so they've used that as evidence of racism. But part of the problem with that is that you can't distinguish it from a novelty response. So, I mean, most people in a given racial group are far more familiar with members of their racial group. And the fact that they're more likely to associate negative things with racial groups that are outside of their racial group isn't something that can be easily distinguished from just a novelty effect. But they make wide-ranging claims about the inbuilt biases in people, and that's lent impetus to these movements that are racing through corporations across the United States and governmental agencies, where people are being subjected to mandatory unconscious racial bias retraining. And there's no evidence, by the way, that works at all. In fact, the evidence that there is suggests quite the contrary.
I saw this on one of your videos. You were discussing how preposterous this is on one of your videos because one of the people that was opposing you was actually a part of something like this, right? Yeah,
well, the human resources and equity people at the University of Toronto have made mandatory unconscious racism training, anti-bias training, and they've made it mandatory for their staff. And I found that absolutely appalling. First of all, it's political re-education.
So when you say mandatory, like this is something that you had engaged in?
No, I didn't have to because I'm not part of the human resources staff.
Okay.
But the people that they're consulting with to implement these sorts of programs certainly have faculty and students in their sites. I mean, these are trial runs for much broader rolling out of exactly this sort of re-education
process.
What's
the methodology behind it, and how's this been vetted?
Oh, I don't think it's been vetted at all. Like, if you're going to, let's say you want to put into practice an educational process, what you need to do is you need to measure the initial state validly so that so you need to use multiple measures, and all those measures need to say the same thing. So if you're going to accuse someone of racism, you need several different measures of racism, and then you have to show that across all the measures, it's like using different meters. All the meters should read the same thing. Then you have to implement your educational intervention, carefully defined. Then you have to see afterwards if the consequence of the educational effort was a reduction in those initial indices, those initial measures. That sort of thing, when it's been done at all, has showed that educational interventions of that sort that are mandatory actually make racism and bias worse rather than better. But why let a few facts stop you? Because we already know from the postmodernists that there's no such thing as facts anyways.
So there's...
Look, in Canada, here's something. This is one of the things that really makes me proud of my country. Our government has now announced that the judiciary in Canada will be selected. If you're going to be a candidate to be a judge, you have to produce a dossier that specifies your identities, whatever they happen to be, racial, ethnic, religious. And then the committee that's going to appoint you to the judiciary has to have undergone mandatory anti-racism and bias training before they're allowed to serve on the committee. So basically, we've set up a situation in Canada where the people who select our judges have to go a kind of indoctrination that has no validity from a scientific perspective before they're allowed to select our judges.
Now, who's enforcing this? Where did this come from?
The Justice Minister. But the Federal Justice Minister.
Where did this program come from?
Oh, yeah, there's all sorts of people who are offering these programs now.
And so
it's become a growth industry.
But what is their qualifications? That's a good question, right? None.
Qualifications.
Zero.
Yeah,
huh?
yeah.
The eyebrows are raised.
Yeah, well, there's no way of having qualifications for doing this sort of thing because it's not a valid procedure.
So how do
people
they
who claim to be qualified?
So they claim to be qualified. They come to the university and they say I have a solution. The university says, finally, just run with it. And
That's
they just
exactly
implement it because to question anything that would absolve racism is racist.
Yes, right. Yes, and they did that in collaboration with the Black Liberation Collective, which
Explain that one, because that one's adorable. The Black Liberation Collective, isn't that the group that somehow thinks that white people are inferior because they don't have enough melanin?
Yeah,
so they
it was
started
by a woman who said exactly that. She's a black supremacist, and she said that the reason that white people are inferior is because they don't have enough melanin in their skin, and melanin apparently is this agent. It's a pigment, but it's apparently this agent that transforms cosmic energy into wisdom. I mean, she's completely. You can make up your own mind about her, and then the other person who started the Black Liberation Collective is a woman who used to work for the University of Toronto Students' Union, who is now being pursued by that students' union for embezzling $300,000 from that organization with the help of a couple of her cronies.
Well, why let a few facts stand in the way of abolishing racism?
Yeah, well, they also are perfectly willing to promote violent means of social transformation, and the university claims that it's in favor of safety. Because they've gone after me because my refusal to use compelled pronouns has apparently made the campus unsafe. But they're perfectly willing to take advice from the Black Liberation Collective, and not only are they willing to take advice from them and not disavow them despite their support for violent means of social revolution, they're also pushing equality of outcome on their employees. And the people who taught their mandatory anti-racism and anti-bias training program said outright in their training material, which I have copies of, that any institution that doesn't have equality of outcome as part of its characteristic at every level of the power organization is corrupt and should be restructured. Wow. But that pales in comparison to my refusal to use compelled pronouns, obviously.
I just don't understand how this gets so